Gary, good to see you again. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Awesome. Great to be with you, Ryan.
I'm really looking forward to this conversation because as I was as I was thinking about our discussion today with your new book, Grow Up, um, parenting is, the most fulfilling, rewarding thing I've ever embarked upon, but it's also one of the most painful and frustrating journeys that I've ever been on as well over the past 15 years now. And I know you've been doing it a bit longer than me, but man, it is a wild roller coaster of emotions and highs and lows.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it doesn't matter what people tell you about being a parent or how many tips you've had, or even if you think your parents did a brilliant job. When you get exposed to that, and it's like, you're exposed to it, it's like you got to make choices and decisions, and you're dealing with the pressures of being a functioning adult. It's the most challenging thing you can ever ask anybody to do because you don't get to participate in it without the threads of your own childhood weaving their way in.
Yeah, that's one thing I thought as I read your book in the past week or two is I've had some revelations over the past several years, specifically with regards to my relationship with my father, which was estranged, and he's passed away now, unfortunately. But we always had a decent relationship, but there was a lot of strain there. And as a young man, it was hard for me to see that I had put him up on a pedestal that I don't think was fair to him. And when he passed away, I took him off that
Right.
pedestal and I started to see him as a man. And that also happened too when I became a parent. I was like, oh man. And my only hope with parenting at this point seems to be, and I'm saying this a little bit tongue in cheek, but also a little bit accurate, is I hope one day my kids will forgive me too.
And listen, that's not that's not it's an unusual thing to say. It's not an unusual thing for someone to think. Um, One of the things that I wanted people to get out of this book to get out of it was part of the deal with growing up is to make your parents wrong for what they did and didn't do. That's part of the design. And it's designed that way to make your departure easier. So when you're 18, 19, 20, 21, you start, you're getting knee deep in your own life and what you want to do with your life. So that kind of critique of how your parents are doing begins at about 10, 9, 10. And then as you get a little bit older and a little bit older, you're starting to kind of that mystique starts to melt away. And you end up with a judgment. I've got an 18-year-old son right now. And I actually just said to him today, I said, yeah, you must enjoy that like at 18, watching me parent and working out all the ways that I'm getting it wrong. Because that's the nature of the beast. Um, and so I think what I want people to really get with this book is the biggest thing you can give to your children would be number one, authenticity, but number two, to just kind of lay your cards on the table in terms of like how you're doing and how they're doing. And no pretenses, no like trying to hold up to some past or some noble venture. You're going to get this wrong. You're really going to get it wrong at times. And I think the more authentic you are about that, the better.
I know I've had a rough a year and a half. I went through a divorce and obviously trying to help my kids transition through this. And it's been very challenging. But I had a really cathartic moment with my oldest son. This was probably about a month or so ago. And I thought this was blasphemy as a parent, but we had a deep conversation. And I said, among other things, I mean, a lot of that conversation is between him and I, but among other things was, I'm sorry. I know you're struggling and I'm struggling too. And I'm doing the
Right.
best that I can right now with the tools that I have. Just know that I love you. I care about you. Your interest, your best interest is what's in my heart. And I'm going to get it wrong from time to time. And man, that was a connection that I think we hadn't had for a very long time, but it was something that I almost thought wasn't appropriate as a parent to say I'm sorry, or I'm
Right.
lost too. I'm figuring it out. It didn't feel appropriate. But then when I read your book, you talk a lot about this authenticity of being true, being honest, I think is the term used, being honest with your
Yeah.
children.
Yeah. I mean, look, you can't you can't share everything with your children because there are some things that would just be irresponsible to share, right? You'd be burdening them with something. But to say, look, this is not easy for me either, or I'm struggling with this too, or I'm not always going to get this right with you, right? And I'm not. Oh, and look, I think that's one of the biggest burdens of being a parent is the pretense that you somehow are getting it right, because we pretend it's like in the back of our minds, we're like, I think I might have just screwed that up, but I'm just going to continue like I know what I'm doing. So I think it's important from time to time, especially in those challenging times, to be able to just get your cards on the table. I mean, I've had those conversations with my sons, but I've said, all of my sons, I didn't get that right. And there'll be other times when I won't get it right, but that doesn't mean to say we're not going to do what I'm saying we're doing. We're going to do that. I'm just not always going to get it right. I'm going to lead the way, but I'm not always going to get it right. And I think your children kind of watching you dealing with that authentically, I think it gives them access to that, gives them a doorway to be authentic, to say, oh, this is all right. I don't need to pretend that I've got it together or pretend that this isn't bothering me, which, kids will do that all the time. They'll say, they'll deny what's bothering them. So that kind of pathway of being authentic from time to time to get your cards on the table. And look, because the truth is, we don't have this figured out. That's the truth. We're working this out. Um, and life comes along and hits you upside the head. And so what are you going to do then? Just try and, fuffle your way through it? Are you going to say, look, this is the direction I'm taking? And again, with my children, sometimes I get that right, sometimes I don't. But that's okay. And I need them to know that that's okay for them too. They're not always going to get it right. But I believe in them. And so there's this kind of like, it's like this environment of authenticity that you start to create with your children that just makes for a much healthier and more empowering kind of circumstance or situation.
I think one of the concerns that at least I have, and I'm sure other men feel this way, is that when we are going through difficult times, we don't want to, you alluded to it earlier, we don't want to burden our children with emotional baggage that isn't theirs to carry. I actually ran across a
Right.
term, and the term is escaping me right now. Maybe you know what it is, but there's the concept that, and I think this happens in divorced couples, where, for example, a son may take on the fatherly role in the home of the single mother, and the
Yeah.
daughter may take on the motherly role or the
Yeah.
wife role almost of the single father. And I want to say parenting transference, or there's, I can't remember the term right offhand, but that is unfair
Yeah.
when you put all of that emotional baggage on them and they can't be kids. And now all of a sudden a son believes he needs to be the husband to his mom, and a daughter believes that she needs to
Right.
be the wife to her father. And I think that's the
Right.
extremes, right? One extreme is I don't share anything. The other is I
Well,
share everything and burden my children.
right. Right. So I think, it's very challenging to get to be a parent. It's very challenging to be a parent when the parents are divorced or divorcing. It just adds an extra thing in there. The only one thing I would offer in that kind of environment is there needs to be a meeting of the minds. There needs to be an area when it comes to the children where you both say you're going to continue to function together in their best interests. So you might not be together as parents, but you're saying when it comes to that subject and what's good for them, we're going to work that out between the two of us and function for them, even though we're not together. So I
Mm.
used to have this saying. This was years ago when I was doing a lot of personal growth work and doing workshops and stuff. And I used to say, I'm committed that families work, whether they're together or not. And that was my big commitment in life. I was committed that families could work. They could work things out. They could make things workable, even though they're not together. So I think that's important when there's a separation or a divorce, right? But you're bang on the money with your kids. It's important that you don't burden them, and and you got to be clear about that. Like I'm not expecting you to be anything other than the way you are. I'm not expecting you to change the way you are at all in the face of this. All you need to know is you're still loved, you're still cared for. I got your back. Both your mom and I have still got your back. So that'd be one thing. I don't talk about this in the book, but I actually talked about it in my last book. In relationship, when it splits, when it doesn't work, you got to resist the urge to go down that pathway of kind of barfing it all up with each other. There has to come a point where that ends, where it's just like, I think the way I said it in my last book is you got to end the relationship with the same kind of values that you started it.
Mm.
And that's challenging. It's very challenging because at the start of that relationship, you said something like love, honor, and protect or something. All right, well, that's how you end it, with those same principles. And again, it's like, I think somebody said, they called it like lighthouse parenting. That is, it's less about what you do, or sorry, less about what you say and more about what you do, because that's what they watch more than anything. And I do get into that in this book. I say, like you're being observed, and everything you say and everything you do. Now that doesn't mean you say you need to kind of walk around in eggshells, but you do need to realize like they are picking up cues as to how they should be or how they should not be. So you should kind of treat those kind of things responsibly, like not like a burden, but really like the opportunity to demonstrate something. Because your children are going to face these challenges in their lives too. Maybe not these ones, but similar ones, life-changing situations that come along when you don't feel like you've got your shit together. You know, how do you keep your shit together when you feel like you don't have it together anymore? How do you form some kind of foundation, some kind of principle based, foundation for you to make your way through these times? And I do think in this book, I do touch on that and I get into that with people like, and as I always do, life is it's not lining up with what you want.
Yeah, I mean it's a challenge. As you're talking about, I like how you said end the relationship the way you started with those same values. That's actually really powerful. The other thing I often talk with guys about, because there's a lot of vitriol and hostility and animosity towards
Yeah.
exes in these situations. I don't have that, so I want to be clear. I don't have that with my ex, but there is a lot of that for other men, and they often ask, how do you overcome that? Well, it's the same way that you would overcome not wanting to go to the gym or not wanting to go to work and do your work for the day. Like, it has to be done. There's a reason why it's done. And so you may have vitriol and animosity and hostility towards your ex, but you can make a decision to be amicable. It's not for her. You may hate her. It's not for her. It's for your kids. It's for you. It's for your own well-being, and it's for your kids to see how these guys say, I would do anything for my kids. Really? Would you treat your ex with dignity for them? Well, you don't know my ex. I don't need to know your ex. Like, what if treating your ex
Exactly.
with dignity is the best thing you could possibly do for your children?
I'll give you a little addendum to that, a little piece to add on to that. When you're in the throes of that thing, when you're in the, either the beginning of it or in the middle of it, right? And there's that big temptation there, and it's a massive temptation to what I'm going to call indulge yourself. And you're going to indulge yourself. You're going to indulge your anger. You're going to indulge your fear. You're going to indulge. You're going to double down on it and go for it. You just need to realize all of that you're doing will have to be undone at some point. You'll have to undo it. Now, maybe not with a person. You'll have to, at some later point, come to terms with yourself. A lot of people will just justify their way to death. Justify, 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 justify. But in the background of their thoughts, they know that was bullshit. And they know that that's not who they are. And they know they're not proud of that. and they know that that wasn't their best moment. So the more that you can function out of some, like I called it, some kind of value-based principles, the quicker you'll go through that process. You have to go through it quicker. Now, that doesn't mean to say just bottle everything up. You know, you can journal, write things down. You can go see a therapist. You go work out. You can, meditate. There's a lot of things you can do to deal with that. Do personal growth and development work, whatever you need to do. But yeah, like barfing up your guts, it doesn't actually serve anything. People will say, "Oh yeah, I feel better after it." Yeah, I know, but then it starts eating it. You get the temporary relief, and then it comes and gets you.
Yeah, well, that's the hard part is you get some sort of validation immediately, right? It feels good. You say something nasty, or you get her, or withhold something from her that she might need or request, and you're like, yeah, got her. It feels good, but like you said,
Right,
long term, it's
right.
not going to serve you or anybody that you care
It's just
about.
payback. It just keeps toing and froing and toing and froing.
Yeah, yeah. I do have a question about the line between with regards to children. I was talking with the woman that I'm dating, and we were having a discussion about parenting. And I think we have a little bit of a disagreement in this, not so much so that we can't come to some mutual understanding, but I'm really curious on your thoughts with regards to the line of allowing children to freely express themselves, freely pursue things without our own biases or thoughts into that, schooling or religion, for example. The
Yeah,
line between that and then allowing and offering guidance, instruction, focus, and even offering our bias towards what we believe will lead them to a
yeah,
more fulfilling life.
yeah. It's all good, but your children mostly won't take that on. They'll do their thing. So if you think about it this way, okay, think about the formative years, think about the years between, say, 4 and about 18, 17, 18. Okay. In that pocket is when a human being will come to some pretty significant determinations. Okay. And they come by themselves.
Gary,
You cannot intervene in that process. No matter
I,
what you do, no matter how regularly you do it, and how incessant you are, they will come to their own determinations. And very often, they're the exact opposite of what their parents were trying to instill, because a child must have the freedom to make those determinations, and they do. And that doesn't mean to say you don't live your life a certain way, doesn't mean to say you don't guide your children, doesn't mean that at all. You just need to be prepared for, and they might go the exact opposite way from whatever you're suggesting, because that is the want of a developing human being.
but do you think that there's any sort of element of this idea, this concept of the prodigal son, where you might instill a set of values and beliefs and virtues, and they may stray purely out of contempt, just rebelliousness, and then at some point maybe uh, fall back or come back to what they had seen as an example that you have set in their lives?
They might, they might do. I think what you have to realize, without going into the neuroscience of it too deeply, because I'm not a neuroscientist, but you're born with a certain kind of genetic soup that will make you kind of predisposed to X, Y, or Z. It's not half you, half your wife. It's your family and her family, right? And that's the soup.
Mm.
Um, so there's that. And then there's just the way that life happens to a human being, right? So by that I mean, in this book I talk about trauma. I talk about a child will get traumatized, which a lot of people are like, well, I was never traumatized. Everybody's traumatized. If you think about a child coming into this life, like curiosity, imagination, creativity, and then it meets the world, and then it meets people. So rather than trauma isn't necessarily traumatic, you got to think of it more like an interruption to the way that life was. So life is going along, you're 7 years of age, and then boom, an incident. It doesn't have to be particularly big or, like I say, traumatic, but it changed you. And from that moment on, life took a turn. Those turns, a parent has absolutely zero say in what those turns are and when they're happening. Zero, no say in it. So that's why you can live your life by a certain set of values, but you'll meet people all over the world who are the complete opposite of the values with which they were raised. And there was no returning. There were other people who had to explore it for themselves, which I think is way more valuable. You can say to your children, look, this is how I live, and this is how this has benefited me. You're going to have to make some of these decisions on your own as you're getting older. You can copy some of these things, but you might want to adopt some new things of your own. See, that's a much wider and more available kind of future for your child rather than because ultimately, it's the old saying, whatever you resist persists by function of your resistance. So whatever you press and press and press and press, you're less likely to get that outcome.
Yeah, I want to get to this concept. I think what you're talking about now is learning to let go of things outside of our control. And I want to get to that. Before I do, when you said every child is traumatized, I think is the word. Is that right? Traumatized. That's the phrasing you
Yeah,
used.
yeah,
A little bit of me like cringed, like because if everybody's traumatized, then nobody is. And I think that in society we have this tendency of over dramatizing scenarios. Like for example,
right,
my mom would whack our butts with a wooden spoon, but she didn't beat
right,
us black and blue. I wasn't ever,
right,
molested by, my uncle. Like those are what I
right.
would consider traumatizing events. But I think the distinction you're
Yeah,
making is that we all deal with things that change us. The wooden spoon changed me until it didn't. I remember,
right.
I remember I got to a certain age and my mom said, I'm going to get the wooden spoon. I'm like, go ahead, give it your best shot. Like at some point is just it
Yeah,
was no longer relevant. Another tactic was necessary. um
yeah.
and
But
we have a great
but
relationship,
you
but
see,
then
by the
you're
same
talking about,
token,
go ahead.
no, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say, but then I think you're
Well,
making the distinction between traumatized and traumatic. It sounds like you're using those two words as different things.
right. So people just think about it like this. If you think about your life like this, if you think about it like this pathway, and the pathway is clear, right, when you start out this journey of life, and then, like I said, life happens. So things come along. Some of them are, I think you could say, would be described as objectively traumatic. Okay,
Yes,
like
agreed.
wow, someone went through that, right? But people get traumatized by being singled out in class in front of all the other kids. One moment, life changed. It was like life is suddenly like this, and that experience hit them. And what children experience is a failure to be in those traumatic moments. They experience failure to deal with what they're getting presented with. So they become something. And it starts in those moments. They become something that eventually, right? Like, so one of the things I would say you became from that was independent. So if you look at your early childhood, you became independent. Somewhere in that little kind of fluctuation of life, you learned that being self-sufficient was where no one could get you. So then that's what I would call, yeah, that's one of those moments where life is going along like this. Something happened, then it went there. It went there. Now, when it went there, believe it or not, that was actually a decision of yours. And believe it or not, no one could take that away from you or alter that. And in fact, even though it was a decision of yours, you probably have very little recollection of having made it, because it was like an adjustment in a moment of time. And once you'd adjusted to that other path, off you went. So then you go on that pathway. So when I do call them traumas, because they're like, for that 3-year-old, 5-year-old, 8-year-old, 9-year-old, in their mind, it was a big deal, even if it lasted 5 seconds. And you can talk to people, you can get into it with people, and they'll take you back, and they'll be like, "Oh yeah, there was this time." And I remember I had a client one time who had really, really simple experiences with a group of friends. He said, "Let's go do this thing." They were on their way to do it, in the last minute, there was about 8 of them. He was only like 10 years of age, and they all said, "No, let's go that way." Now that's nothing. That's a nothing, right? But in that moment, he felt betrayed. And that experience of betrayal for that little 10-year-old boy just sunk right in with him, like clunk. Like they turned their back on me. And so it became a thing for him in his life. He started to pick up the little nuances. Because that's what I said this in earlier books. You're not quite born a blank slate, but man, there's a lot of blankness. And so that's why I talk about it. Like, if you take the case that you have these things in your life, whether you think your childhood was traumatic or not, and I've coached an awful lot of people over the years, and people who've come in and said, "I had a great childhood," and I'll say, "Okay, let's take a look." And they were right there. They had their moments when life took a turn and soured this thing, or, like a very common one, my parent says, "My mother was the weak one," or "My father was the weak one, and the other parent was the strong one." Now, that child created that dynamic in their mind and followed it and believed it and gathered evidence for it and found, yeah, other biases were coming to the fore, like all the way through the life. Same with divorces. They might not admit it to you, but one of the two's getting the blame, right? So one gets the blame and one's the innocent one in the mind of the child. You can try and undo that with them, but that's really only something they can undo for themselves later when they become adults and they work their way through it. You can kind of point them in a direction, like, look, this is one of these things that happens. And there's no bad person here. There's no good person here. This is just one of these things. But yeah, these kind of changes that you'll see in your life can sometimes be very subtle and seemingly innocuous.
The question then is, how as a parent do you help your children navigate that? So as an example, my empathetic intelligence isn't real high. I don't have a lot of empathy. I don't have a lot of time for, and even as I say bullshit. It's not really bullshit, but like I interpret it as that sometimes. If somebody else is feeling something, for me to say it's bullshit is probably not right. But
right.
For example, I might have one of my kids, and my kids don't wear glasses, but I'm just throwing this out here. One of my kids might come home from school and say, "Oh, little Timmy called me Four Eyes." And my thought is, well, yeah, welcome to life. Get tough, get over it.
Right.
But what you're saying is that might be something that actually means something significant. So how do you manage, hey, you're going to have to get tough versus let me put my arm around you. Let's talk through it. I don't really think there's a lot to talk about in that situation, but I don't know. I don't know how to navigate.
Ask him a question. Ask him one question. And the question is, what are you making that mean? And you'll get right to the heart of it right there.
I'm writing that down because that's a question. I like the phrasing of it. What are you making that mean? It doesn't actually mean that, but what are you making it mean?
Right. So what do you make it mean? And you can say to them, look, I get that you would make that mean that. You don't take it away from them, but you're starting to let them see that, to quote Sartre, the great French existentialist, people make meaning out of fucking everything. Right? Even the way I'm talking right now, you've got listeners who are adding shit to what I'm saying and like, oh yeah, either agreeing or disagreeing, coming to their own conclusions about me and you and this situation, because that's what human beings do in those formative years. Some of those meanings, if you like, that children come up with stay with them for a lifetime. A lifetime. So if you look at, if you don't mind, I'll use kind of your situation as an example, okay? When you would say to your kid, yeah, well, welcome to life, get over it, kind of deal, right? You weren't born that way. You turned it out. There was a time before that. You became that way at a point in your life. That way that you, and it brings its own set of problems, right? It's not the golden ticket.
Right. It's not the
It can be a real
singular
strength of
right
yours.
way.
No, because it can be a blind spot. You can leave people with the experience that you don't care, even though you're trying to get them to get that they shouldn't care. It's so easy to leave them with the experience that you don't. And they're like, oh, he doesn't give a shit. You understand? Even though what you're trying to do is equip them.
Right.
And that's another part of the parenting thing that needs to come with authenticity. And I say this all the time. Don't be vague about why you're doing what you're doing. Be clear about why you're doing what you're doing. It's not that I don't love you. It's not that I don't recognize you're feeling something right now. What I want to do is equip you. That's a different conversation than get over it.
Powerful.
Understand? So you're kind of letting your children in on, listen, like I don't always, and I think that's part of the problem because I talk about, again, back to the Sartre thing about adding meaning. If you're not clear, you're leaving the field open for your child's imagination to take over with what you're saying.
Yeah, I actually had an experience with that over the weekend. It was my daughter's birthday and we celebrated and did her thing all day and we had a great time. And she stayed up a little past her bedtime, which was fine. No problem. It's her birthday. We're having a celebration. Family's over. Good. Uh, and then it came to a point where I've decided it's time for her to go to bed. And I told her, hey, it's time for you to get your pajamas on, brush your teeth, get ready for bed. Let's go. And she was like, why? I said, because it's time for bed. It's past your bedtime. Like it's time for bed. You need to go to bed. And that was the reason I gave her. And my mom was in town and she had told me the story. And I guess they were talking afterwards. And she was really upset because she thought that I didn't care about her birthday because I made her go to bed at this certain time. And fortunately, my mom had my
Right.
back. She was like, no, your dad loves you. He cares about you so much so that he wants you to go to bed so that you can get sleep and be well rested and wake up tomorrow in a good mood and ready to tackle the day. And I'm like,
Yeah.
yeah, those are things I probably should have explained, but my mom had to in that case. Fortunately, she was there to be able to pick up my slack.
Right. Right. But it's so true, like we do things in the name of something. I mean, I'll tell you one of the big in the name ofs, okay, as parents is fear. So I'm doing this, but really I'm afraid of something else. That's why I'm doing it. So we've got a lot of in the name ofs, like I'm saying this and I'm doing this because la 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 la. But if you get underneath it, you'll see a lot of times with parents, it's the fear of how this might turn out if I don't. It's the fear of where they might end up. Because ultimately it comes back to the same thing for parents. We're shit scared that we're going to fuck this up. That's it. We're scared we're going to fuck it up. And that is what adds to a lot of those pretenses and a lot of those in the name of, right? Because I'm definitely a rules dad. I definitely have rules. I don't have a ton of rules, but I'm a rules guy. So we got a little amount of rules and we stick to them, even when it's not convenient for me. So it's not convenient for me for us to have this rule, but we got it. So here we go, right? And so like like I said, I don't have tons of them. I don't box my children in. that way, because all they'll do when they hit 13 and 14 and 15 is just try and burn the house down, maybe even literally in an environment that they can experience freedom in and they can be free in it, but it's still an environment that is there is a bit of a bubble here. That's right. Because in that bubble, you get a sense of the world from a fairly safe perspective, but it doesn't protect them from their own imagination.
What are some of the rules? Do you still have kids at home, or are they all out of the house now? And what were those
Yeah,
rules
no,
when
my
the kids
oldest
are
is
at home?
18. I have an 11-year-old at home and a 9-year-old at home.
Got it.
Um, I mean, like it's bedtime at a certain time, definitely a rule of ours. The toothbrushing, all that sort of stuff, homework, that sort of stuff. Whatever things they're in. So if they're in, you know, music teacher or something to do with sports, they got to be all in with it. If you want to do that, we're all in it. We don't we don't paddle around. So if we're going to do it, let's do it. And I'm big on that with the kids to let them experience what it's like to go 2 feet in on something. And so we do that even when it gets tough for them. We still do that. We still pursue that. And then the simple things like, being respectful, like, and it's, and they don't always get that right, and they don't, like, they'll say things, in a fit of temper or some, upset they've got, or maybe just carelessly. So I tend to be very understanding. But the big thing for me with all my boys is tell me the truth. If you tell me the truth, we'll work this out. If you lie to me, I'm going to handle you first. You're probably going to end up with something you didn't want to do. Then we're going to work it out. So you're just going to double up on it. So being truthful to me is key to everything. Like, it's just cards on the table. And when my boys put the cards on the table, there's no repercussion other than we're going to talk it out and repair any damage that might have been done. That's it. I'm not going to be like, oh, well, now I'm going to double down on you because you did that. If you tell me the truth, then we'll work it out.
Mm. Are there times where you're asking your boys to tell the truth? And I think that's a great rule. And I imagine that for most of us listening, and you and I, we would say that we do tell the truth, but that's probably not entirely accurate. And are there times
Yep.
and places where it's appropriate that we as parents don't disclose the entire truth, or should we hold ourselves to be entirely truthful?
No, so that's when you got to be responsible.
Hmm.
So I got to look at this kid and say, you're 10 or you're 8 or you're 7. How much of this can you take? So let me communicate this in a way that you can take right now. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to communicate this in a way that you can handle it, because I'm just not going to give you something that you can't take. Right. And, that's, to me, that's responsible communication. One of the things, there's two types of responsible communication. Okay. The first one is being responsible for what you say. Okay. So that is, what am I doing with that? Well, I'm actually looking at how might this go down with that person. Right. That's being a responsible communicator. The other side of the responsible communication is responsible listening. So that is, am I adding anything in here? Right? What am I bringing to the table here? So I think I talk about this in the book. I say, speak like it means everything and listen like it doesn't mean anything. So I speak like the words that I use, I talk like, what's coming out my mouth is going to land. So the younger they get, you got to be the responsible one. You got to be like, okay, so how can I phrase this in such a way where they get a sense of what the world is right now, laying the burden of it on them. And yeah, that can be tricky, but that is the job. That's what you weigh shake from authenticity, right? Some people mistake authenticity for candor. Oh, I just freaking tell you, right? That's not authenticity, right?
Mm. I like that
Authenticity
distinction.
begins, right? Well, authenticity begins with talking about yourself, right? Like, Mostly when you hear a lot of, especially these days, people talk, well, I'm just being my authentic self. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
no, you're actually being an asshole
You're being a dick. Yeah, exactly.
right now. you know, um, and so people, when they're complaining or venting, that's not authenticity. Okay, that's letting out your upsets. That's not authenticity. Begins with, I mean, let me give you an example. I might really dislike someone. Authenticity would be me saying, I've been hanging on to my view about that person and I've been letting it sour me. That's authentic, right? Not like this person is. Again, those are the kind of examples when you speak that way in front of your children, you'll hear them talk that way in not too long a time. They'll start to key in, they'll watch, they'll hear, because authenticity, as long as you're not, I mean, you don't, again, authenticity isn't dwelling in your upsets. Authenticity is fundamentally telling the truth about yourself, right? Um, and with no shame, no guilt, no, not blaming anybody. I'm not hanging on to it. I'm not pitying myself. I'm not victimizing myself. I'm just being upfront and straight about it. Listen, I've been being this way. I've been being angry. I've been being upset. I've been blaming other people for how this is going, and that doesn't work. That's a powerful conversation. And then, one of these days because my children will do it too. It'll come out their mouth. Like my older son, he's his aim is to become a professional soccer player, and he's playing in a pretty prestigious setup here in Germany. And he came off the field the other day, and he's like, "Oh, that ref!" And and I just went, "Okay." I just raised my eyebrows, and he went, "Yeah, okay." So what happened was the ref made some decisions, and I lost my focus. And I'm like, "Ooh, that's powerful right there, right?"
Yeah.
He says, "What I need to work on is staying focused when distractions are happening around me."
Mm,
I'm like,
that's
that's
powerful.
power right there. That's like you got the mindset. You're pointed in the right direction. And I think the more you're that kind of person, the more you're that kind of man, the more that becomes the environment around you.
Yeah. I used to have a coach, that experience you just shared. I used to have a coach that when we would complain in football in high school about the referee, ruining the game or making a bad call, he would always say, "Why did you let the game get so close that a single call from the referee would determine the outcome?" And it was like, oh, yep, that's exactly right.
Yeah,
One bad call from a
yeah,
referee determined the outcome of the game, or did you play that horribly? It's like,
right,
yeah, we need to take ownership of that.
right, right.
How
And so that kind of responsibility isn't burdensome.
How do you, maybe this pivots and shifts gears a little bit, but one thing you mentioned is being authentic, meaning starting with yourself, self-assessment, self-reflection. And then I think as we do that, at least in my experience, as I've done that, I feel a lot of guilt and shame for the way, for example, that I've
Right.
showed up with my children, or how I may have disciplined them in a moment or reacted to a situation, or even the breakdown of the nuclear family within my dynamic, which is something I value, something I cherished. And I hold a lot of guilt and shame in that. How do I begin to, or anybody who's listening, begin to release that? Because I think if I do and learn how to do that, I can lead my children as their father more powerfully. But it's still really hard for me to overcome those things.
Yeah. So guilt doesn't show up in a vacuum. It's not just showing up because it's not just what you did. Okay. So I'm going to use the same question on you. You did what you did. Now, what do you say that means about you? And you'll see what the meaning you're adding. Well, this means I'm,
Yeah, it's a lot of negative self-talk in to answer those questions. A lot, like
yeah, right,
I
right,
failed,
right.
I'm a failure, those types of things.
Very good. Right. Now, just hold that right there. Okay. Just hold that thought. right there. That, what you just said, that is the one thing in this life that you're out to avoid at all costs. That's a
Saying that or being
childhood.
that?
No, what you just said, I'm a failure. That's like an undercurrent, very
Mm,
common amongst men, by the way. But anyway, that's an undercurrent. Like that's everything you're building is to prove that that's not true. And then when you have these moments, up it comes. So you experience this guilt or sometimes shame, guilt and shame, or I talk about in the book, they're like the twin towers for human beings, right? They arise, guilt and shame, they often come up together. And so if you want to talk about traumas, right, that recurring, I'm a failure, but I'm avoiding it and I'm getting past it. And look, I'm not, but it's in the background, like waiting to come up. It's like trying to keep a beach ball under the water. Up it comes, right? And then I'm going. And then, so then, oh, I'm in a good spot. Things are going well. Da, da, da. And then bang, and up it comes, right? So it's like a recurring battle. And sometimes it feels like it literally, but it's a mental battle, right? And so one of the things that I invite people to take on for themselves is whenever you do reflect and you find yourself in these spots, because you will find yourself in them. You don't. I mean, I wish we could all aspire to what Sartre said, but it doesn't mean anything, right? Now, when Sartre said that, he was basically saying, no, it is in fact fucking meaningless. There is no inherent meaning in any of that, right? We adhere and add meaning to everything, but in terms of the universe, it doesn't mean anything, right? That doesn't mean to say it's pointless. It doesn't mean to say it's without repercussion. He's just saying there's no inherent value in it. It's just that,
but does
right?
that drive
So
to future nihilism where it's like, yeah, that didn't mean anything? Well, I mean, does that keep us from improving?
no, well, no, because it's like instant forgiveness of oneself. So I can be like, I'm a freaking human being too. I've made mistakes. I can't, because sometimes we live with this model in our mind of this kind of perfect human being. I'm just going to be that. Which on its own is impossible, right? Because, there's much at times, right? I mean, neuroscience is still arguing whether we have free will or not. I mean, it's not like, I'm just throwing up to the wind, but there has to be times in your life and those moments of self-reflection where you're just not going to continue punishing yourself. When you're saying, I did what I did and I own it and I own all of it, but I'm not going to continue to punish myself for it because it doesn't serve me and it doesn't serve anyone. And in fact, that self-punishment, try this on, is a way of absolving yourself of blame. So
Explain that.
self-punishment, yeah, is a way to distract. So, and I do talk about this in the book. I talk about the importance of the tribe and how you appear to the tribe. So, and if you try on the idea that a lot of what you experience as a human being is a communication to your group. So a lot of what you do and everything you do, everything you say is a communication. You're letting people know, right? Even though you might not be saying anything, you're letting people know. Here's what you're letting them know. I'm not saying anything. So you're always communicating something. And so that sense of shame, that sense of guilt is a communication to the group. And what's the communication? Communication is, I've fucked up, but can you see I feel bad for it? Because ultimately what we're, even people who are like fiercely independent, you're only ever independent in the context of the group. If there was no group, then there'd be no independence. It's only against the background of community and group that one is independent. So then that whole idea of like, well, what's the communication here? And in the book, I kind of dig into, I say, in society, how we punish is we exclude.
Mm.
So we cut out, we exclude, we push away. So we
Isolation.
do it in relationships too, by the way. It's how we punish in relationships. If we're having an argument, I'm done with this. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. That's the punishment. So I exclude. Like, boom, I'm shutting it down. I'm taking control, and there's no more communication here because I say so. But the intention is to leave the other person with no voice and alone. And often those people will turn to their friends and say, I need to, that. But that's the point of seclusion, right? And so if you take it to the extreme in society, someone breaks the law, they go to jail. Or you go to prison. You go to prison, you continue to break the law, you're isolated. It's this constant cutting and moving to the outside of the tribe. Why? Because, you know, back in the day, 1,000 years ago, if you were kicked out of the tribe, you're dead.
Mm-hmm.
You're dead. So isolation, that's why, like in relationship, if somebody leaves a relationship and one person wants to continue that relationship, the person who's left there has that experience of like abandonment and vulnerability and being exposed, and they hate it and it feels terrible. But that's that kind of primordial experience of being isolated, being left alone. And I know there's guys out there like, well, I love being alone, but I get that, right? But it's all in the context of the group, right? That's your little bubble of safety. So, so then with the shame and the guilt, you're basically saying to the group, I'm punishing myself, right? Look at what I'm doing, right? And it's a big thing if you look at like in society when maybe celebrities or whomever maybe do something, whether they really mean it or not, when they're apologizing, right? They're like, I don't think that was a genuine apology. Because that's what we're looking for. We're looking for the authenticity. Do they really mean it though? Like, listen, look at the way they are. And we're picking up on all those little cues, right? And then the more they are about it, then we're like, okay, you can stay in the group. That's
Mm.
basically what we're saying. You can stay in the group. So if you try on the shame and the guilt, if it's continuing, then you got to ask yourself, okay, what am I getting out of this? What does it absolve me of? What does it kind of, what does it get me away with? What is it? You got to look down those avenues to see if there's some, in other words, a payoff for you. If there's some kind of payoff, you'll often see there's a payoff in it. And that's okay. That's a human thing. And that's what I come back to. It's okay. You're a human. You're not going to get this right all the time. And if you experience the shame and the guilt, I get that. Okay. And one of the ways you can do is you can clean that up with the people and say, look, I didn't do the best there. And I own it. And I own all of it. And I'm not going to use excuses for why I did do it or didn't do it, but I own it. And I acknowledge and I'm responsible for the impact that it might have had on you. I'll own that too. And then you say to them, and if there's anything you want to say about that, if there's anything you want to communicate to me, I want you to know I'm available for you to communicate to me, to talk to me about that. I'm not shutting you down, and I'm not going to even try and change the way you feel about it because the way you feel about it, I get that. That's how you feel about it. Now, again, you hear the authenticity, you hear how flat it is. There's no freaking drama in it, there's no big hoo-ha in it. It's just laying it out there and being responsible and owning it and realizing, you know, you're not you're not going to get life right. And you are going to screw some things up. And those are the times when, and I talk about this deeply in this book, about the power of blame and what it does to a person and what it does to a family and what it does to a group or a company. You take blame out. You say, okay, I'm not going to blame anybody here. Then where do you turn? What you're left with is, okay, well, there's no juice here. I'm not blaming anybody. It's just like it went the way it went. I'm not going to be like, yeah, and you did, and then I did, and then they did. When there's no blame, there is no shame. There is no guilt. They can't exist together. Shame and guilt require blame.
Mm. Yeah, it's really powerful. I want to shift gears, and I can't believe how quickly the time has gone. There's a segment in the book that I really like, and it's towards the end, and you talk about the three heirlooms. And I think that conversation is so valuable. We often think about, personally, I think about, how do I leave my financial legacy? Is the business that I'm creating, this movement,
Yeah,
something that can be handed to my children and they can be engaged in it and have a leg up? But when you talk about the three heirlooms, it's completely different than any material gain that we often as fathers think about passing
right,
down to our kids.
right, right. I want my children to know what it is to love another and to express love. I want them to know what that is, you know, all of it, and how to continue to return yourself to loving people. Because sometimes you need to get yourself back there. You can drift away from loving somebody. You need to get yourself back there. That's a massive thing for me. Authenticity is another one. Like to get your cards on the table. It's such a massive thing for people. And when you can be authentic with no shame or no guilt, you're fucking bulletproof.
Mm.
You're bulletproof. You can take it all. That's a robust human being. They can lay it out there and set it empathetic to how what I've done or didn't do. It might have impacted other people, but it will not shake me from owning it. And then the last one is forgiveness, which is it's a tricky one. And I said that in the book. It is a tricky one. But what makes it tricky is you can't get to forgiveness and have your blame. You can't get there. Not unless you're going to go into some kind of self-righteous version of forgiveness, which isn't forgiveness. Forgiveness simply comes down to one thing. I'm no longer going to punish this person. And if you can create that as an environment at home, you'll equip your children in a very powerful way.
Taking some notes here. I tell the guys, I often joke, like, I feel a little bit selfish when I have conversations like this because it seems like they're more for me than anybody else. And I'm the one who gets to ask the questions. Other guys are like, ask
Well,
this
why
question,
not?
ask this
Why wouldn't
question. I'm
you?
like,
Come
I don't
on.
know.
No, but you're being the guinea pig too. I mean, come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
No, why wouldn't you? Yeah, of course you should.
Well, Gary, I appreciate you. I appreciate your work. And ever since you came on, gosh, it's been years ago now, but when you came on and talked about Unfuck Yourself and your other books, I mean, I've been a
It
fan
is.
and I've been sharing this work because it is so crucial. And also, I got to say, the way that you communicate it, I think is really relevant to men. It seems to me there's a lot of like woo woo, like feel good, spiritual journey type stuff. And I
Right,
think there's probably a place for that. It just doesn't resonate with
right.
me. The way you
Yeah,
communicate it really resonates with me. And I know it does with a lot of the guys as well.
awesome. Brilliant.
Well, will you let the guys know where to connect with you? Obviously, they can pick up a copy of the book wherever books are sold. It's out today as of the release of this podcast. But where should the men connect with you
Yeah.
to learn more or to communicate with you?
The book is called Grow Up and Becoming the Parent That Your Kids Deserve. And you can connect me at garyjohnbishop.com. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Threads. I think we're fucking calling it X now. X.
Yeah.
I'm on X. I have a Facebook page, of course. Um, and I have, there's still a ton of episodes of the Unfuck Nation podcast, which goes into these kind of topics, like some of the struggles that we have as human beings, goes into these subjects in depth. But it's not an interview platform. It's really just me talking about, philosophical issues and how they equate to human beings. So Unfuck Nation, you can find me there too.
We'll sync everything up. The term that I was thinking about earlier with the child becoming the
Right.
quasi wife or husband is
Yeah.
parentification.
Yeah.
Parentification. That was the term I was looking for earlier. So I wanted to make sure I cleared
That
that up.
makes total sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
That
Well, Gary,
makes
again, I
sense.
appreciate you,
Yeah.
and we'll stay in touch. We'll get
Brilliant.
this into the
Awesome. Well,
hands
I need to look
and
into
minds
that
of
now.
people.
I
So
never like to dig into psychology because it's not my thing, but I'll take a dive into that.
it is. It's an interesting concept, and it's something that's been on my mind. Am I doing that to my children? I certainly don't want to rob them of any
Right.
childhood opportunities or think they have a greater responsibility for me than they actually do. So it's something on my mind.
For sure.
Gary, appreciate you again. Thanks for joining me today.
Awesome, Ryan. Thanks for having me.